Okay, we'll give you a few minutes to, if you want to leave, just it seems how you've seen who's presenting now, but at the same time, encourage you to stay to hear some of our issues. There was the introductions is, hi, I'm Kelly Wright. I do the environmental waste management, the Shoshone Bannock tribes. This is Susan Hanson. She works for the tribes as an environmental contractor. And we're going to be talking about environmental impacts where we live here in Fort Hall.
Next slide, please. To just show where we're at in Idaho, location of the Fort Hall Reservation, where we're all at today. Kelly and I are going to talk about some of the issues, environmental issues that are impacting Fort Hall and the surrounding communities that have been going on for quite some time. And Kelly already introduced us, so we're going to just kind of be passing back and forth. And feel free to stop us at any time if you've got questions. Next slide. So our story starts quite some time ago, but Fort Hall Reservation is home to the Shoshone Bannock people here in Southeast Idaho. And a lot of the environmental issues have and continue to impact the customs, culture, health of the tribes and people living on the tribes. We have a number of national priority list Superfund sites that are impacting both the reservation and the Aboriginal homelands. And the large ones are the FMC Corporation, which was a elemental phosphorus plant. And the operating one still is the JR Simplot plant. And you probably saw that if you flew in and you were heading to Fort Hall, it was off to your right. That is the JR Simplot plant. It produces fertilizer. Right next to it was an elemental phosphorus plant, which was the largest elemental phosphorus plant in the United States. And the phosphorus there went into products that we all use, laundry detergents, toothpaste, Pepsi, whatnot. But it shut down the plant in 2001, and we still live with the residual contamination of that. We also have a number of mining sites. If you went on the tour yesterday evening, you went up to the Gay Mine, which was one of the first mines that used the ore. The ore from that mine went to Simplot and FMC. And that ore was mined from the late 40s all the way through 1993 when the mine shut down. And then the companies used ore that is mined from other phosphate mines in what they call the phosphate patch, which is over by Soda Springs. There's been impacts to groundwater, surface water, soils, vegetation, everything from these mines and the operating facilities. Next slide, please. Eastern Mashad Flats is a Superfund site here on the reservation. The FMC Corporation is within the boundaries of the reservation, while Simplot is adjacent to the reservation. Simplot is still an operating facility, and it makes it unique, but it makes it really hard to deal with because it is on state land. So the state of Idaho, the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality, has regulatory authority for the day-to-day operations of the hazardous waste, the RCRA sites. And the gyp stack, while it's an operable unit with the Superfund and it leaks contaminated water that leaches through it, that's a CERCLA operable unit. But the day-to-day operations of it is a RCRA unit. And it just makes it very complicated to handle the contamination, but in the end, the groundwater contamination that comes from that site leaches through the ground and comes up into the Portneuf River and flows onto the reservation. And after, 30 years of the site being on the Superfund site list, we still have ongoing sources. Next slide, please. Air pollution that comes from the JR Simplot plant. You can see this is what it looks like on days when there's moisture in the air, or, just same old thing that goes on. And Fort Hall's impacted, the city of Pocatello's impacted, and so is the city of Chubbuck. And you can smell this plant, you can smell the odors from the plant. Next slide, please. This is FMC. It doesn't look like that today because there's been some, I need to get down here. Because there's been work on the slag. It's been covered up. Caps have been put on the ponds. Depending on what pond, whether it was a Ricker pond or a Circle pond, was the level of capping. But this is what it looked like before the caps. The slag pile, which is to the top, that is slag that was used throughout Southeast Idaho. It's an excellent road base, but it's not used because there's an agreement not to use this. It's got radioactive material in it, and you just can't monitor where it's at and who's working on the roads and how long they're being exposed to it. So the companies agreed not to sell it anymore. In that slag pile, there's 22 rail cars buried, full, well, we don't know how full, but with elemental phosphorus in them. And I'm gonna pass the mic over to Kelly. Well, the question was, what does this cause health-wise? And if you're asking about the slag contains residual amounts of radiation. And so there's, if it's radon that's coming out, that can cause cancer. If it's radium-226 and 228, if you're exposed to it for long enough and it absorbs into you, those are also cancer causing. Well, and also that's what's in the slag, but what's the problem, one of the larger problems at the site, we have ongoing groundwater contamination, and we are in the process of developing a pump and treat system, finding wells that you can actually pump out the contamination within the plume and treating the water. And then what's being proposed is to re-inject it back into the aquifer to kind of flush it through. And we're having some issues and discussions with EPA right now, because the water that they want to pull out, although it is, we are going to be pulling out water that is contaminated with arsenic and other nasty things. So that is a good thing, but to treat it, you have to put in ferric chloride and a number of other things. And so when it's re-injected back into the aquifer, it's not going to meet standards. And the tribes are having very colorful discussions right now with EPA, because the Water Resource Department and the council has said we don't want water that doesn't meet secondary maximum contaminant levels to be re-injected into our aquifer. And EPA wants to do that. Well, it gets diluted. And that's a lot. That's a problem with a lot of contamination in sites. The water's still contaminated, but when it flows off and it mixes with clean water, the contaminations are diluted. It's not that they're gone, it's just they're diluted. And a lot of times monitoring occurs in a place where it's been diluted already. So you're not seeing the true concentrations.
Okay, one point that I think needs to be made here was in 1991, FMC was cited by EPA for being the worst polluter in the area. It got the largest RCRA fine at that time. RCRA is when a facility is operating and they're supposed to be, and there's a history there of who thought they had the authority. Some say it was the state, some was EPA, but they never recognized the fact that tribes should have been. But we now have the Waste Management Act where we can actually have regulatory authority on fee lands. So that's a good thing. And as one of the other things I think you need to understand is there's over 20 ponds that were covered up out here that contain the elemental phosphorus waste / other hazardous constituents that were left in place. If you're looking at the screen, you see the up on the left-hand side, those are what was called the calciner ponds. And those are on the state side. So here's where it gets complicated. You've got the calciner ponds and then Simplot just adjacent there. We've told EPA numerous times, we're tired of being industry's dumping grounds. Now we heard from some of the people yesterday, they have trans boundary issues. Well, so do we. We are a sovereign nation and that's a state. And that's EPA should not allow the state of Idaho's IDEQ to operate it there. And unfortunately, the compliance enforcement guys left because I think the picture that Susan put up there clearly shows that we have a major concern there. And this is one that if you really want to get mean, you ask. CERCLA, okay, EPA, CERCLA is supposed to be at the end of the series. So when does CERCLA stop and RCRA get to begin? And that's what we've got at Simplot. Oh, okay. This young lady says she has a solution. If we could get her a mic. Oh, sorry, I guess I've got the mics. Well, now I have, oops, excuse me. That mic don't work anymore. I think that was a hint. You can give this one to her. I'll try to put that one back together.
No, I was going to say, what if the tribe sell that land? Then you guys have more option to go in there and clean it up. Because there'll be more people involved then. So what do you guys think? To the state, whoever that buys it.
The tribes don't own the land. It's within the boundaries of the reservation, but it's the FMC corporation that owns it. It's on fee land. So, as Kelly said earlier, we have, the tribes have moved forward in a number of areas. We have a Waste Management Act, we have cleanup standards. And actually, we have a court case. The Supreme Court went back and said that the Ninth Circuit, one of the decisions stood that says the tribes have jurisdiction at this facility. So there's been a lot of progress there. It's just, cleanups are slow. They don't have to be, but in this case, when you've got companies that would rather go to court, it's slow. Next slide, please. So I think we talked about a lot of these things. It was the largest elemental phosphorus producing plant in the United States. I guess what we haven't talked about is when it shut down and we started cleaning up, FMC left between 5,000 and 16,000 tons, tons of pure elemental phosphorus in the ground. And that's significant because elemental phosphorus is such a unique chemical that if it gets air to it and it oxidizes or water, it turns to phosphine gas. And phosphine gas is toxic. It's deadly. And that's what we have here. We have phosphine gas that continues to be generated every single day in those RCRA ponds. The RCRA ponds, there's a long history. There's a RCRA consent decree that was signed in the late 90s that Department of Justice was involved in, that forced the company to close out those ponds because they were operating them illegally. They had to put caps and covers and gas extraction systems in it. But we are still here, 20 plus years later with these ponds generating phosphine, and it's the phosphine moves outside the ponds into the soils. Next slide, please.
So in other words, that's contaminated forever.
Yes. Elemental phosphorus will remain reactive for up to 10,000 years. So it's long beyond our children's children's children. Past the 7 generations, if that elemental phosphorus stays in the groundwater, where there's a monolith under where the old furnace building was, or in these ponds, it will be there forever. And it will continue to generate the phosphine as long as there's air and water getting to it. So we have asked, we continue to advocate for them to excavate.
And Simplot is still there.
Well,
and then they're still doing the same thing they were doing before. So can they be sued forever and ever?
well, Simplot isn't within the boundaries of the reservation. It is on, here's a picture of the JR Simplot plant. It is a fertilizer plant and it's adjacent to the reservation boundaries. So we get to receive all the waste and all the pollution. Simplot's on state land, but it is part of the Eastern Mashad Flat Superfund site. And, I will say there's been progress made with Simplot as part of the CERCLA Superfund actions. The company had to line their gyp stack. So what you see here is, well, this is an old picture. It's much taller now, but the gyp stack has ponds, some of them are 20 acres, 40 acre ponds. And they had to line, part of their enforcement action was you must line it. So water isn't leaking down. At some point, we had 900 gallons a minute leaking through the gyp stack, picking up contamination that went through the gyp stack and flowing out into the Portneuf River. It's now lined. It doesn't mean that there's no water leaking through there, because it will. There'll be residual water. It'll take 20 years to dewater this, but it's better. That portion of it's better, but we still have, there's a long ways to go. There is a pump and treat system for their contaminated groundwater. Don't talk about this. And they pump out and treat about 60% of the contaminated groundwater. So that means, we still have 38 to 40% that continues to flow off that site into the Portneuf River and onto the reservation. And, we continue to tell EPA this isn't good enough. You can't just, you need to work with IDEQ. IDEQ entered into what's called a VCO, or a voluntary consent order, with the JR Simplot plant to let them have some time to get into compliance. And, this, I don't know the exact date. I want to say it was 2010, 2012. I don't know if the IDEQ regional administrator is here anymore, but needless to say, we've got about 10 years. They were supposed to come into compliance. They had 2 different compliance dates and they've blown by those, both of them, into the Portneuf River. So it's time to do something different. They need to do some additional actions. Next slide, please.
I know, Portneuf is getting all that water, and that water is coming down to bottoms. And the water there is creating the fish to have 2 heads. And now we got 1 sturgeon in there, and I just wonder what's going to happen to that poor sturgeon that's in there now.
Well, there's a lot of things that need to be done. This picture shows you, we get dust off the gyp stack. That gyp stack, on dusty days, it blows all over and it blows onto the reservation, and that gypsum has metals in it and it has radiation in it. It's got radium 226 and 228. It's got heavy metals. We continue to discuss with EPA to try and get there to be something done about this,
Had some cattle just down below, and they were feeding them hay, and they didn't know their cattle had no teeth at one time.
Yeah, and that's the fluoride. Next slide, please. So this tells you just a little bit more about Simplot, but we've went through this. Other than the fluoride contamination, fluoride was identified as one of the ecological risk drivers for the Eastern Mashad Flats offsite. There's been a lot of political things go on. EPA handed over the fluoride issue in the air program to the state of Idaho and said there's no more offsite risk. The tribes are very upset about that because we, as you saw in the previous picture, we continue to have ongoing emissions, the very emissions that contribute to the soil contamination from fluoride. And there is an offsite risk. Clearly, there's risks from the groundwater contamination. There's risks from the air that falls down onto the soils. And one other thing that was pretty significant recently that went on was the BLM land exchange. Do you want to talk about this?
Oh, you're doing well.
No, here.
Yeah, sure. Okay, as she says, the tribes got tired of the land swap that the BLM and Simplot had done. I have never seen the federal government ever do something in less than a week. They had transferred the ownership of the property, including the deed, in less than a week. But that was under Trump's administration, just before he was leaving. So I'm not saying it wouldn't have happened with Biden or anything like that. I'm just saying I've never seen an action go that fast. So tribes got upset with it because they violated several different things, one of which was, and I don't want to bore you with all the details about it, but Congress in 1900 actually passed a deal that if there was any lands adjacent to a reservation, the reservation would be able to purchase that land or acquire it in some fashion. The problem was they didn't talk to us. They just went out and acquired the land. And then at the same time, they underestimated the value. They said they estimated it will say $400 an acre. That's an exaggeration, but it was worth a lot more to Simplot to be able to put their gypsum stack. And unfortunately, and one of the deals that the Judge Windmill had ruled on was from an environmental standpoint, they didn't actually identify where the pond for the transvaporation, which is part of the fluoride problem. And they claim it, and this is the part that upsets me, is they claimed in their deal with the BLM that EPA and the state of Idaho told them this was the only way they could take care of handling their waste. I've been on this project for quite a few years. I've never heard either one of them say that out loud. nor put it in writing. So I was a little upset with BLM and really upset with Simplot because they're supposed to give you this good neighbor policy. And so we feel the pain that some of our, I'll call them brothers and sisters in Canada, Mexico, are being impacted by, and Alaska. And he's not even here. Okay, tell Raymond I picked on him. But we understand the problems that you have because they don't listen to us. We tell them that you've got issues. And so now Brian and Stacy are going to be getting some calls because we get calls from individuals that live in the area, at least on Simplot. The odor is there. It's high concentrations of, well, let me rephrase that. Nobody's analyzed it yet. I'm working on it. I'll get some monitors out there and I'm going to come back and tell you that yes, there's an issue or no, there's not. But at the same time, you can smell it. And they say, and they always come back and tell you, oh, that we didn't have no upsets in the system. It's the same thing. We hear it from the state, we hear it from Simplot. And then you hear something that from an employee that works out there that you may know, and they say, oh yeah, we had a spill or we have this. We never get told any of that. And so it's a good thing I was not allowed to talk to enforcement because I wouldn't have been nice. And so I'll get back to what we were talking about here. The BLM, Judge Windmill ruled that out of 6 things, the tribes got 4. And so it was a nice thing about it is we're still in the figuring out what's going to happen. The problem was the BLM or the federal government in this case said they didn't want to take it down the next step. Simplot wants to take it up and take it directly to the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals. And then you get me into a vocabulary that even I don't understand. But we had to file last Friday and we had disagreed with them. And so there'll be more to come on that part of the BLM. It's not done. We're still trying to keep it in the area. And so next slide, please. This just basically shows you an overview. She mentioned one thing that was important. If you see the little stream that's wandering around and if you can notice the riparian area that goes down, that all flows down into what's considered to be the bottoms. That's a very significant cultural area. A lot of things happen there and a lot of things don't get told about what's there. And one of the biggest problems that we have is tribal members still use that area. And so we're concerned that maybe the constituents are getting down there. We don't know for a fact about the fluoride because that's one that we've started testing out and looking at some of the different deals on some of the cultural sensitive plants. We know that unfortunately with the modern technology, we're not using it. We're using the solution to pollution is dilution. That was the 1970s. That's when I was going to school. That's why you saw it when FMC was in existence. They had this super tall stack. And then you have Simplot that has the cooling towers. And their problem is they were taking and mixing trying to claim that the state had a bevel exemption, mixing waste and putting it up on the gypsum stack, letting it come down. They were putting it on at about 1,200 gallons a minute and only getting at the bottom, I'm going to say 400 gallons a minute was coming out. So you've lost roughly 800 gallons of water per minute that was going somewhere. And so that's why they had to go back and put a liner on it. But my biggest problem with liners is liners leak. They're designed to leak at an approved leakage rate. So those constituents, and that's where Susan brought up the fact that in the gypsum stack, it's actually going to increase because there's not as much water getting into it and the chemicals have been left there or We hope they're bound, but obviously they're not, because we're still seeing it in the port or in the springs or in the samples that were taken. So we're looking forward to actually seeing something happen at this facility. This has been going on they started in 1949. 1970s, the USGS identified that they had contaminants in the water. And then finally in 1991, when they issued FMC, the citations under RCRA, it was 91 was when EPA listed it on the national priority listing. And that's means it's it's in the top. And at that time, it was in the top 10 of being hazardous to the, I'll say, environment/human health. So I'll give it back to her.
We can get through this. Yeah. What was that?
Okay, these are actually processing plants. And all the mine you saw up there, all of that.
Yes. Yes, during what happened, FMC had well, they just discharged directly into the Portneuf River for many, many years. In fact, one of their violations was for how many pounds of arsenic a day. It wasn't until actually it was the late 1990s that EPA gave them a NIPDES permit, because all they were measuring before was temperature of the water. So once they got their non-point source discharge permit, some of that had to be cleaned up. But, you know, after 50 years of having arsenic dumped into the Portneuf River, there's damage. And they no longer directly discharge. FMC closed down, but Simplot, the groundwater comes up through multiple springs in the Portneuf River, and it discharges that way. So it's surface water under the influence of groundwater. What's that? Yes. 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 I don't know if this affects the salmon. What this does, in fact, I wouldn't say it does. But what this affects is the Portneuf River, and then it flows into the American Falls Reservoir.
Hello, I have a question. I was wondering about are there any health studies that have been conducted, or are there going to be any future health studies? I've noticed that people on Bannock County side, more so than on Bingham County side of the reservation, or the southern side of the reservation, appear to contract cancer, and the death rates on the reservation, there is a high, my personal opinion is cancer rates.
So in the early 90s, there was a I don't want to say health study, but ATSDR, Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. They come to sites that are MPL Superfund sites, and they did come to Fort Hall. I think they took some urine samples to see if there was heavy metals in individuals. It wasn't I don't want to say, don't call it an official health study, but it was an assessment. What was done was later in the late 90s, as Kelly talked about, there was a RCRA consent decree. It was between the Department of Justice and the FMC Corporation. And we had what was called SEPs, Supplemental Environmental Projects. And one of those, the tribes had requested that they did a health SEP. And it turned out to be a big mess, because FMC was in charge of the purse strings of it. Part of the enforcement action was they had to put aside some money. It was like 1.6 million to conduct this health study. But they, being FMC, was responsible for how that was spent. And the tribes hired, they had doctors from Chicago that specialized in epidemiology and environmental contaminants, radiation. Anyway, it was a long process. What they did find from it was there was an increase in upper respiratory infections in children. A lot of that. That health study is still open. That SEP has not been closed out because the Ricker consent decree hasn't been closed out. It didn't find what it found new things, but not necessarily what people had been concerned about. Next slide, please. So this community is also impacted by mines. As people saw, if they went on the tour last night, we've got the gay mine that's within the boundaries of the reservation. A lot of it's on allotted land. Individual tribal members or families own parts of that, as well as the tribes. There is the gay mines, roughly 7,000 acres with about 4,700 acres contaminated. It's got 57 open pits. It's got mill shells. It's got overburden. It's a mess. We've got a lot of different wells there. The groundwater is contaminated. A lot of the groundwater, the shallow might be, between 100 and 200 feet, but some of these wells we've had to drill between 300 and 500 feet just to get to the groundwater. It's going to be there for a while. We have high walls, and the tribes are very concerned about the high walls. The north limb, which we couldn't get to, it's sloughing. It's 300 feet down. It's straight up and down, and it really is dangerous because there's people that hunt up there, they recreate up there, the tribal members, and it's just dangerous. And the tribes have asked over and over to have these high walls taken down, and that's an issue between with the BLM, because the BLM does reclamation and EPA does remediation. And if you were to just, let's say, take down those high walls, then you might create more contamination on the remediation side. So we continued to work through the very slow process of the CERCLA actions. The gay mine is used for grazing, and the farmers are informed about the selenium contamination and the risks, and they choose to graze their animals at their, I don't want to say at their own risk, but they're provided with that information. It's their livelihood. They have no other place to put their cattle. There's 17 inactive phosphate mines impacting roughly 17,000 acres in southeast Idaho, and those inactive phosphate mines are on the tribe's Aboriginal homelands. The tribes are working through an NRDA process. Hopefully that will be settled soon. The ore from the gay mine and Smoky Canyon mine was shipped via rail from the gay mine. Smoky Canyon mine is through an underground pipe from Soda Springs to the JR Simplot plant. There's additional mines proposed for 7,300 acres. 2 of those have recently been approved. One of them, Judge Windmill just shut it down because there wasn't a proper NEPA process done for some of, I think it was for sage grouse. And there's future mining. Next slide, please. We're going to try and hurry through this because I think we're really behind.
We got 5 minutes.
Okay. This just shows a map of all the mines in southeast Idaho. There's a lot of them. Next slide. And these will go fast because these are visual pictures of them. This is some of the cuts from the North and South Maybe mines, and we are actually going through a risk assessment process at these mines. Groundwater contamination is a big issue. Next slide. This was a Pedro Creek ODA. It failed, as you can see, but this is, if you were at the gay mine, this is what a lot of the things at the North Limb looks like. It sloughs off and it's ready to just cave in. Next slide. Smoky Canyon Mine, this was a few years ago. It's much more developed now. This. Next slide. All of the mines, all of the selenium issues happen because of some livestock mortality issues. I'm gonna really try and go through this quickly. I can find this on here because I can't read up there. So in 1985, there was about 200 or 300 sheep deaths. What happened is the sheep grazed on some of these ODAs that had selenium that had been uptaken in the grasses. In 96, you can see the animals and the deaths. But, you know, we've got about 1,292 animals that have died from consuming contaminated grasses or vegetation that grew on some of these areas. And this hasn't even been updated because recently, as 2018, they had another horse kill in Lanes Creek, and cattle. So this is what started the whole selenium. It's not that it's just selenium at these mines. But this is what killed the animals. When there's certain vegetation that preferentially uptakes selenium once it's been oxidized, and asters are these beautiful little flowers, but if a cow gets one mouthful, it can kill them. Same with alfalfa. Next slide, please. Some pictures of the game mine. Next slide.
The.
Talking to the mic, Kelly.
This is the east limb of the.
Okay. Just real quickly, we referred to the north limb. This is the north limb. You can see it used to be a mountain and they cut right straight through it and they never did anything. It's still, I mean, they took everything out and left it. And that's where Susan was saying, we're seeing a lot of the sloughing that some of the others are having. So we'd have some, okay, I'll turn it back. Next slide. The next slide's get, this one here is where we took you up last night, showed you the South 40. Kind of gives you a better picture of, there is a lake in there or a little pond. There we did have the salamander death in the early, late 1990s. And so we know that there is selenium concentrations that are of a concern. Next slide. And so now we're going to risk scenario. And I'm going to throw her under the bus again, because tomorrow she gets to talk with the Office of Research and Development on tribal risk scenario. This is an important.
Yeah, this is something that I think it can help all tribes. I'm being told 1 minute. So, you know, it should just be, we shouldn't even have to think about this, but at Eastern Mashad Flats, which is within the boundaries of the reservation, and same with the game mine, we had to fight with our federal agencies, and I'm talking EPA, I'm talking the Forest Service, I'm talking BLM, to get them to recognize they need to conduct a Native American risk scenario. It doesn't seem, you know, that we should be doing this today, but we do. And it's very critical because risk assessments determine what's cleaned up and how much is cleaned up. And they are very critical to protecting human health and the environment. And, you know, we've had situations where the companies want to use industrial scenarios. We continue to work with the federal agencies and say, for instance, if the tribes have a treaty that allows them to go to an area and hunt or fish or gather or perform ceremonial activities, they deserve to be able to have those resources clean. And it's up to the federal agencies to keep those clean for those uses, not for a calculated, oh, a tribal member only uses it 8 hours a year or 2 days a year. And so we continue to say you need to clean it up for protection of the tribal treaty rights. And I would encourage everybody in any of their projects they're looking at to ensure that a Native American risk scenario is done, because there are very unique exposures in every different community with different plants and different cultural activities, different consumptions, different adsorptions, different chemicals. And it's those things that put you at a higher risk. Next slide, please. I think we talked about this. You know, these are just some of the issues that we have went through with the federal agencies on limiting, you're not gonna use water from this area that's contaminated in your sweat lodge. You are only going to be consuming so much of this plant. And we just continue on and say, no, you need to use a actual consumption rate. People aren't eating 8 ounces of elk a month. 8 ounces is the size of your fist. That's how much people consume, in one meal, not for a whole month. Next slide, please.
I hate to be the person that cuts you off, because this is very important information that you're sharing with us, and it sounds very complex. And you are giving us a better idea of what is really happening in the area around here. And I would like for everyone to give them a big round of applause. I'm so sorry, but I think Kelly and can you remind me, Susan, if they're going to be around, please, if you have questions, talk to them.
We will. And the nice part about it is all PowerPoint presentations will be on the WUVA, or however the electronic thing that they've got. So there's contact information and youth. And I look over here and I see an elder, but I'm an elder to her. So I can say, I'll shut up and let the next people talk, because we'll be in the hall or we can be around. Feel free to ask us anything you want.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Virginia Moncisco. I'm with the Environmental Waste Management Program of the Shoshone Bannock Tribes. And if I have my staff, would they please come up? Not my staff, but I mean my coworkers. And we just want to, welcome everyone and thank everyone for coming, especially the people that have came from so far. I've noticed there was a lot of Alaskan people that, I met yesterday evening at the Gay Mine Tour. And we would like to share just a little bit from our program, from the tribes program, to give to the people that came the furthest. So without any ado, would all the Alaskan people raise their hands? Cool. Okay, and our ladies will be by to give you a gift. And we'll hurry this up for the next event. Thank you, everyone. Oh, and by the way, this is Tilda Edmo. She works with Environmental Waste, and Susie Moss. And we also have Cody Odell, and I'm not sure where he's at. Anyway, give your hand a raise so they can come by for all the Alaskan people. Thank you.